Well, welcome to the lounge here at Burton Avenue United Church. I'm Bob Clay and I'm here with Alan McGee to share with you some thoughts about why the early Christians might have seen Jesus as the long-awaited Messiah. Our intention is to provide on the Burton Avenue website a presentation like this each week through the weeks of Advent leading up to Christmas. So what was it that the early Jewish people were expecting at the time of Jesus, the Second Temple time? Well, the book by Tom Wright, called Simply Christian, suggests that the late Second Temple Jewish people were expecting a Messiah who had links to the temple, to the kingship, to the Torah, and to the new creation. So through this series, we're going to explore each one of those topics each week. The first questions that we have to consider is what might be the cultural milieu that the Jewish people were living with at the time. What had been their history and why might they have been expecting a Messiah at all? And then the second question is why might we, or what might be the evidence that we have that the early Christians, the early Jewish Christians, were expecting that Messiah to be Jesus, or did they see that Messiah in Jesus? So the history of the Jewish people leading up to that Second Temple, really the basic histories here is that the political heyday for the Jews, the time when they had the most autonomy and a high amount of prosperity, and the time when they had a lot of status in the region, the Queen of Sheba came to visit, was at the time of David and Solomon. So that's really the time period where the early Hebrews had their most presence in the region. Subsequent kings after David and after Solomon tended to drift away from God and tended to drift away from that religious experience and that religious worship of God, and tended to rely more on their own political ambitions and intrigues and abilities. And those intrigues often led them to alliances with the nations around them. So in 722, before the time of Jesus, the northern tribes of Israel were destroyed and completely obliterated, never ever to return. And then about 150 years or so later, the southern tribes, the ones that were named as Judah, were conquered by Babylon, and the ruling classes were exiled to Babylon. And they returned in 538, just about 50 or 60 years later, under Babylonian control. And that time of the exile was really a significant time in the minds of the Jewish people, and something that reverberated through their prophets and through their literature for a long time afterwards. From that point on, from the time that Israel was occupied by the Babylonians until well after the time of the Romans, the Jews were under a constant occupation, with the exception of one period from about 167 to 63 before the time of Jesus. And during that period of time, they managed to wrest the control of the country and wrest the control of the religion and their temple from the occupiers. And it's that time that the current Jewish people celebrate Hanukkah at about this time of the year. So from the time of their exile and return from exile, basically the Jewish people were almost constantly under some kind of control. First the Babylonians, and then the Greeks, and then ultimately the Romans, who really controlled the political lives in Israel. So what would that have done? What kind of responses might we have expected from the folks in that time? See, so the society they lived in was a very hierarchical society, even much more hierarchical than we are now, with the Romans and the Roman emperor right at the top of the heap, and then as you go down, there's less and less and less control. The ruling elite tended to manage or tended to support their lifestyles and their luxury on the backs of the agricultural peasants. And there was often an oppression to those lower status groups, the sort of everyday Israeli people and Jewish people. So at the time, Jewish apocalyptic writings, and apocalyptic means sort of at the end of time, those writings begin to appear at the time of the Greek and the Roman occupation. And they're quite common, these writings, and they have some general themes that they share. They first of all share the hope that God will restore the balance in the world, that God will relieve the oppressed and punish the oppressors, either now or at the end of time. They also dream of Israel's glory returning to the time of David, to that heyday, that time of autonomy and prosperity, where the nations surrounding Israel would also worship God. So there's this unification under God that's expected. The kingdom of God, if you will. Many of the non-biblical writings of the time, such as the Dead Sea Scrolls, some of the books of Enoch, all share these kinds of hopes and dreams. And in the Bible, the Old Testament book of Daniel is the best known of those apocalyptic type writings. They also tended to hope at this time for a Messiah who would restore Israel to that former glory. And that hope for restoration and putting things right and for punishing oppressors and easing the oppression also shows in many of the New Testament books. The Gospels and Revelation are also some of Paul's writings. So the Messiah was expected to have this link to the temple. There was this notion that, and as Tom Wright says, there was this notion that there was going to be a connection between this anticipated Messiah who would set things right to the temple. And so, what might have been those connections? Why was the connection to the temple so important? Well, if you remember back to the early parts of the Bible, in the story of the Garden of Eden, God and Adam and Eve, the people, lived in close contact with one another. They lived together in this sort of heaven-type experience of Eden. But after the fall, after the time when the people were evicted from the garden, the notion was that God was still living in the garden, in heaven, and the people lived outside. And so they weren't living in close connection with God. And it's an interesting point to think about that it wasn't a spiritual place that the people went to. They just went outside of the garden in the same sort of setting. So when God lifted the Hebrew people out of the slavery and the oppression in Egypt on their journey to Canaan, to the new promised land, God went directly with the people. God lived with the people. God was present in the pillar of fire and the pillar of smoke cloud that went with the people. And at the time that Moses got the Torah, the Ten Commandments, from God on Mount Sinai, those 10 commandments, those blocks, we're told in the Bible, were put in the Ark of the Covenant, and they went with the people. God was right present with the people in the Ark of the Covenant, and that Ark of the Covenant was put into the holiest of holy places in the tabernacle. So you can see the beginnings here of God being with the people in the tent of the tabernacle. And when Solomon built the temple after David's time and dedicated the temple to God, the Ark of the Covenant with the Word of God inside of it was put in the holiest of holies in that temple. And after the temple was dedicated, God's presence was seen in the temple. in a sense, as Tom Wright says, heaven and earth intersected in the temple, in the middle of the heart of the temple. That's where God was seen to live, and that's where the people went to worship God. So in a sense, it was sort of like a little bit of a return, in a way, to the Garden of Eden, where people were living close with God. So here we see in the book of Kings, and if you just read down at the bottom, and I'll give you a moment just to read through the whole thing, but you'll see that once the temple was dedicated, God's presence as a cloud, just like the cloud that went with the people from the journey from Egypt to Canaan, God's presence filled the temple. So God was clearly seen to be living in the temple, and that's where the people met God. Well, ever since the time of David, there was this sense that it was going to be the king who would rebuild or who would build the temple, as Solomon had done with that glorious temple that Solomon built. And that's some of the things that Tom Wright talks about in his book. At the time of Jesus, just shortly before Jesus, Herod did rebuild the temple. There was a pretty glorious building that Herod had built. And it was the political and it was the religious center of worship for the Jewish people at about the time of Jesus. And we hear in the Gospels them talking about the temple and going to the temple to worship. But you see, Herod was an Idumean. He was of Edomite descent, and there wasn't a direct connection between him and David's line. We're going to get into this a little bit next week, but it may have been that for a lot of people, Herod wasn't really seen as a legitimate king. He was appointed by the Romans to be the king of Israel, but certainly not of direct line descendant to the royal family of David. So it's a good question about whether Herod's temple might have been seen as a legitimate temple, and whether God might have actually been seen to be living in that temple. We're also told another really interesting little thing to remember, that at the time of Jesus' death, the temple veil was torn. And that sort of is code for God leaving the temple at the time Jesus was crucified. You can see here that in Exodus, we're told that the veil that was torn was there to separate the place God lived in the original temple from the rest of the temple. So it was a very significant tearing of the veil that happened at Jesus' crucifixion. So where do we get this notion? Where did the early Christians believe that that God may have become present in their lives? Where did they meet God if God had left the temple? And there's a number of places in the Bible, in the New Testament, that we're told that people were starting to see God in a different place. In John's Gospel, that was written towards the end of the first century of this current era, John says, the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. The implication of that is that the people were starting to see Jesus as the place where God dwelled. And certainly they were starting to have this sense that Jesus was divine. And so God's presence was in the person of Jesus, who had been resurrected and was alive. Jesus himself said that he had received all of the authority on heaven and earth from God. He says that in Matthew's Gospel. We're told in the book of Acts, at a time when Paul was in Athens, and he's talking to the Athenians who were looking for where this God that Paul worshipped was. And Paul says, well, God doesn't live in temples made by human hands. The implication is that God is with us in persons and in Jesus, not in a temple. And he's clearly refuting the notion that God is in the temple. And finally, if we look at the book of Revelation towards the end of the first century again, John's revelation from God, at the time when at the apocalyptic time at the end of time, John is told in his vision that the new Jerusalem that has been created has come down from heaven to replace the current Jerusalem. We're told that in that city there was no temple, because the temple was God and the Lamb, which is Jesus in John's sort of code. So it seems, folks, that at least by the end of the first century, Christians were seeing Jesus as the place where God existed and God was present with the people, in the same way as that before Jesus' life, the temple had been the place where God was in with the people and had a presence with the people. So that's where we are to this point, and next week we're going to talk a little bit about why it may have been that the early Christians identified Jesus with the kingship that they were anticipating around the time of the expected Messiah. Thanks for listening, and we'll look forward to talking to you next week.